Now let us talk about project scope management. What is project scope? Project scope is not the same as product or service scope. Product or service scope is the list of requirements for our product or service, for product or service that we produce as an outcome of our project. Project scope is all the work that needs to be accomplished in our project. It includes not only the work to produce the actual project deliverables, it also includes meetings, it includes audits, it includes testing, it includes all the work on the project. It is very important to make sure that there are no unauthorized items included in project scope. Project scope management involves processes intended to make sure that all the stakeholder requirements are collected and they are planned and controlled and executed throughout the project life cycle. There are 6 processes that are related to the scope management knowledge area. And 4 of those processes belong to planning process group. 2 of the processes belong to monitoring and controlling process group. Let's see what those processes are. Plan scope management, it's a planning process. Collect requirements, planning process. Define scope, planning process. Create work breakdown structure, WBS, planning process. Validate scope, monitoring and controlling process. And control scope, monitoring and controlling. Now let's talk about these processes one by one. Plan scope management, the first process. This process belongs to the planning process group. Scope management plan, the output of this process, it's a part of the overall project management plan. And scope management plan is a document that defines how we plan, execute, and control our scope. Now, what does it mean to plan, how we plan the scope? Let's keep in mind that planning does not happen once. Planning goes throughout the entire project life cycle. So at the very beginning, we create a plan, scope management plan, and we address scenarios. What happens if we need to replan the scope or add some additional components to the scope, how we plan those additional scope items. So this is how we document planning in our project scope plan. What does it mean, execution of the scope? Execution of the scope is making sure that the work that was defined in the project scope is being executed, facilitation of that execution, making sure that this work, and specifically this work, is being done, each scope item. Control, scope control. It means that we are, first of all, we are validating the scope. We're making sure that we include the correct items in project scope and that we keep track on any deviation from the scope. We make sure that there are no items that are unaddressed, that there are no unauthorized items that are added to the scope. Scope management plan may be elaborated through additional iterations once the other parts of the project management plan are finalized. Not only other parts of the project management plan, once we elaborate further on the project, we may have to add new items to the project scope, and then our project scope management plan can also change. The scope management plan can change regardless whether scope changes, because we may decide that it will be easier to control the scope, for example, by running it through additional set of reviews or meeting with additional group of stakeholders. There could be different changes throughout the project life cycle. Collect requirements. Collecting requirements, it is the process that includes work with project stakeholders to make sure that all the voices are heard, that all the requirements are collected. Typically, that's the work that is done by business analysts on the project. Sometimes there are no business analysts, it's done by other team members, it could be done by project managers themselves. The bottom line is project manager is responsible for making sure that all the requirements are collected and that all requirements are clearly understood. The reverse side of it is so-called gold plating, when you are trying to please your client and you are trying to include things that you know the client would like, but they were not originally included in project scope. By doing that, it is a very risky approach, because by doing that, you can put project timeline and project budget at risk. It is not recommended to do those things. It's basically the same thing as including unauthorized items into the project scope. Define scope process. That's the process of the creation of the scope statement. If you remember from the previous lesson, there is an integration management process when we create the initial scope statement. The initial scope statement has very high level details, project objectives, and not detailed scope items. Here at this stage, we obtain the input from project stakeholders and we actually fill this document with the detailed scope items. So we receive the new version of our scope statement. The scope statement contains the overall scope description, followed by the project deliverables, assumptions, and constraints, in scope and out of scope clauses, and justification for the work undertaken by the project team. Create WBS process. Work breakdown structure, or WBS, is a tree-based decomposition of all the project work into manageable parts. WBS is a very important input to many project management processes. We use it when we plan our schedule, we use it when we plan our budget, we use it when we try to identify our risks. WBS is deliverable oriented. So when we break all the work into items, we are looking at what we need to produce. We're looking at our project scope items. It is scope based. The lowest level of WBS is called a work package. This is the lowest level. So it's the smallest piece of work on the project. As a result of create WBS process, we receive the scope baseline. So scope baseline consists of the WBS itself, of WBS dictionary, which is the description of each WBS item, work breakdown structure item, and it also includes the scope statement, the document that we have just discussed. Okay, here is an example of the work breakdown structure. You see the project level, you see the control account level, and the work package level. So the control account is the level at which it is the easiest to control scope items, to make sure that there are no deviations from the originally planned scope. Also, the control account is the level at which it is typically easier to manage the triple constraints. The scope, the schedule, and the budget associated with particular control account. Validate scope. Validate scope is one of the monitoring and controlling scope management processes. So before scope baseline becomes final, it is very important to make sure that it is approved by the stakeholders. It is also very important that upon the completion of each phase, stakeholders validate that what was produced according to their expectations. So during the scope validation, we make sure that the requirements are complete and captured correctly. The focus of scope validation is the acceptance of deliverables. We need to make sure that we have the acceptance criteria for the deliverables set up properly. Validation can be done multiple times. It can be done upon completion of each project phase, and typically scope validation results in stakeholder sign-off. Control scope process. What's the difference between control scope and validate scope? Validate scope process is mostly about sign-offs and acceptances. Control scope is about keeping scope baseline intact. So if we see that there are deviations from the original scope baseline, or if stakeholders submit new requirements, in some cases we need to review a change request. So change request is something that is done as part of the integrated change control process. So control scope invokes integrated change control process. We review the change request. We see if it is accepted or rejected. In some cases, we accept or reject the change request. If the change request is accepted, if we say, yes, we are including this item into our scope, then we need to adjust our scope baseline. And then the new adjusted scope baseline becomes our baseline against which we measure our scope. We control our scope against that baseline. So this concludes our scope management lesson. Please make sure that you understood all the information. Please go back to the slides to review them again. See you at the next lesson. Thank you very much for watching. See you soon.